Well, good evening, brethren. It's good to see you guys. Um, yeah, we really miss everybody there. We kind of talk about it almost every day. Talk about you guys, talk about, just how much we miss everybody and look forward to being back. So it's really good to see all you guys. Well, if you have your syllabus in front of you, hopefully you do. Uh, Go ahead and take that out and let's look at it together. Let's start with the course description there on page 1. Um, Typically, New Testament survey courses will go through the New Testament book by book, focusing on the information that's generally found in the book's front material and study Bibles, like author, date, background, reason for writing, things like that. And other New Testament survey courses might focus on the different literary sections of the New Testament. You might take a class in the Gospel and Acts, or the Pauline epistles, or the general epistles. But by contrast, this course will focus on New Testament background issues and how to understand the New Testament more broadly. So we're going to kind of look at big picture overview and then underlying structural stuff, if that makes sense. You might remember, if you took the Old Testament survey, that we focused entirely on the historicity of the Old Testament. We looked at it from era to era. And I want to do something like that here, something that gives us kind of more of a framework for understanding what's in the New Testament and how it flows. It's not going to be nearly as historical as the Old Testament class, but nevertheless, I hope it's at least as interesting and beneficial. Examples of major topics to be covered in this course include the historicity in and behind the New Testament, the relationship between the Old Testament and the New, the canonicity of the New Testament, the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, and other topics. As a result, the student will have a better understanding of the New Testament, a deeper appreciation for its contents, and a deeper trust in the New Testament, the Word of God, and the Lord Jesus. By the way, if you want all that front material stuff, I'm sure half of you guys have study Bibles of some kind sitting in your laps. If you want that kind of New Testament survey, just go through and read all the introductory material to every one of the books of the New Testament. That stuff's readily available everywhere. I kind of want to give us things that are a little more foundational and structural in this class. So, course textbooks, we got the Bible, several different acceptable translations there. You have a few surveys and introductions and study Bibles. Just one quick note about Guthrie's New Testament introduction. That book used to be in the bookshelf in the foyer back there outside of Lloyd's office. Unless somebody's taking it off, it's still there. So that's a really good, solid, basic introduction. And everyone should have access to it. You took it off, Lloyd? So on the next page, there's a few harmonies and chronologies there. If you remember, I provided you with a chronological reading list of the Old Testament that I really encouraged you to look at. There is a chronological list coming for the New Testament. Hopefully I'll have it up on the course page before the end of the class, but I'm still working my way through that. Just as kind of a side note, we talked, when we looked at the Old Testament, what was very obvious is that the New Testament authors were not overly concerned with chronology. They were very concerned with historicity, but they grouped their content according to theme. You know, you guys hopefully remember what I'm talking about, and that just flows so it just dovetails so uh, perfectly with how the Hebrew mind thought in Old Testament and New Testament times. Um, Nevertheless, these chronologies are helpful and beneficial. They really give you a perspective of the flow of the New Testament, of Jesus' ministry. But obviously, all those things we're far more familiar with in the New Testament than we are in the Old. But nevertheless, there they are. There are a few really good resources. I'm actually reading the book by Andreas Kosenberger right now, The Final Days of Jesus, which is a really good, simple book that just outlines the last week of Jesus' life. It's really good. But there are a few other resources there for that. And Lord willing, I'll have the chronological New Testament reading list up on the course page on the Foundations Institute website, hopefully before the end of this course. Course requirements. Okay, in this 9-week course, students will be graded on a simple pass-fail grading rubric. The following requirements must be met in order to receive a pass grade. Be in attendance for a minimum of 7 out of 9 classes. Watch the video lecture for any classes missed. And complete the course project on time and at a sufficient level of quality. Okay, here is the course project. We're calling this Reformed Roundtables. All right. Part 1 is a meetup and discussion. So students will form groups of 3 to 5 men, no less than 3, no more than 5, and schedule a social time together over dinner, coffee, get together and barbecue, whatever it is. But 3 to 5 guys, and discuss an issue or a problem that we encounter in the New Testament church or in New Testament ministry today. Okay, students must select from the following topics, and you got a whole list of them there. There are all kinds of things related to the New Testament, to New Testament ministry, to body life in the local New Testament church. And I'm not going to go over those. You can look at them, but I think there's plenty there for you to choose something that's interesting and profitable for all of you guys who are involved. If you turn over to page 3, the very top one there, which is one that I'm interested in, justify preaching as we practice it today. We have this public corporate style lecture of successive exposition, sequential exposition. So you're going book by book through a Bible, and you do that, for 45 minutes every Lord's Day. And that's like the central aspect of New Testament body life. Okay, we'll justify that practice. That's just one that I'm particularly interested in. But nevertheless, you got a whole list of possible topics there, and you're going to get together at some point over the next 2 months with a handful of other guys and do something fun, go shooting, have a barbecue, have some coffee or something. But make it fun and kind of work it out. That's part 1, is the meetup and discussion. Part 2 is Bible reading. Read 5 times through one New Testament book over the next several weeks. I was going to make it one time every week, but then what if you don't choose your topic for another week? And then in the last week, we have the presentations, which we'll get to in a minute. I thought about that, and rather than make it 6 or 7 or 8 or some weird number that we may not get to because of when you pick your topic, I just said 5. So read 5 times through one New Testament book. And the paragraph says there, each member of the group is required to pick one New Testament book that is specifically relevant to your group's topic. Okay, you guys don't all have to read the same book, but you all do have to pick a book that's relevant to your topic. Okay, maybe it just has one passage that really deals specifically with it, or maybe your topic is kind of a theme that runs through the entire book. Well, whatever it is, just pick a book that is specifically relevant to your group's topic, and then B, Read through it 5 times before the final night of this course. You can use any of the acceptable translations as specified above. That means, Tim, you can't read the Message for this one, unfortunately, okay? You're going to have to stick with a real Bible translation. Okay, Tim? Reading from multiple translations is encouraged, but not required. And a simple reading report must be submitted, indicating whether you did or did not complete the required reading, and that's due before the final night of the class. So at some point leading up to the final night of the class, just shoot me an email. Got my email address there, and say I did complete the reading assignment. Okay. And then part 3 of the Reformed Roundtables is the class presentation. So each group is going to give a presentation to the class before the end of the course, presenting the details of their discussion. The presentation must be 10 to 15 minutes in length, and we're going to have 4 presentations at night. So you really have to make sure to just kind of be mindful of that, of that clock, that 15-minute cap, just for the sake of respecting other people's time. And you must answer the following questions in your presentation. Who's in your group, and when and where did you meet? Okay, and obviously your topic. You got to present that as well. That's the one bullet point that I didn't have there, but you got to give us your topic. You have to tell us what challenges the issue presents. What disagreements did you find within the group, and how were those agreements resolved? What resources were used in researching your topic? Acceptable resources include material from lectures or notes from this class, counsel or advice from a Christian leader, books, sermons, etc., by a conservative Christian leader, past or present. And you need to answer what New Testament texts speak directly to your topic, and how do they apply? And then lastly, how can Christians apply this practically today? So you have a really kind of broad range of things to address, but hopefully that's accessible enough for everybody. Does anyone have any questions about this before I continue? Okay. There's a lag in the video. So if you're going for that mic, I'm not going to know it for like 30 seconds. So, okay.
Doesn't look like we have any questions, Tony.
Okay, sounds good. You know what, Kaylin, if I ask a question, can you just hold on to the mic and respond and confirm? Because I don't really know what's going on based on the video, So if you could just do that and keep me in the loop and what's going on over there, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Will do.
Okay, so final project tasks and deadlines. You are going to choose your group members tonight, okay? And if you see, there's a sign-up sheet that I think Lloyd was talking about. I think Lloyd said it was on a clipboard, and there are 5 lines under each team, and you just sign your name to one of those teams, okay? The names of the teams are the Wittenberg Varmints, the Orthodox Huguenotics, the Radical Rebaptizers, and the Tulip-Minded Ninja Theologians. So groups of 3 to 5 guys sign up on one of those teams, and then there's a little section under that for your meetup day and your topic. All right, so tonight you're going to sign up, okay? Before next week, before next Wednesday, you're going to choose your topic. You guys are going to get together and choose your topic, and you're also going to choose your meetup time and location. And you're going to be ready to put that information on the sign-up sheet by next Wednesday night. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about that?
Yeah, we got one.
Okay.
Hey, Tony, it's Dave Baker.
Dave Baker.
So for the meetup time,
Yeah.
is this a one-time meet, or is it a weekly meet, or
No,
we're gonna meet
just
like 3 times, or what?
You can meet as many times as you want, but you're only required to meet once.
Okay.
Okay. Just make sure that you guys give it enough time to answer the questions that you're going to have to give in your presentation. But if you guys want to meet more than once, that's perfectly fine to do. And then, like I said, week 9, the final night of the class, all 4 teams, groups are going to give their presentation. Okay. Any other questions about that before we move on?
Yeah, we got one.
Okay.
So is everyone going to give a presentation or just one member of the group?
You guys decide how you want to do it. I mean, I figure the way most of those things work, like, what do? You say like, well, I'll talk about this part and I'll talk about this part, or maybe just one guy is the spokesman for the group and he talks about all of it. But you guys are all going to stand up front and you just decide who's going to give what part of the presentation. All right. Okay. Let's turn over to the last page of the syllabus and look at the course schedule. Tonight, we're going to talk about the intertestamental period. Week 2, we're going to look at a timeline, just an overview of New Testament history. We'll get a big picture overview of the era, what happened and when. Week 3, we're going to look at the Greek New Testament itself. We're going to look at the language of the Greek New Testament and the manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, and just kind of get a basic idea of the New Testament that we're holding in our hand. Number 4, week 4, we're going to talk about canonicity in the New Testament. One of the questions, potential topics for study, is why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in the New Testament? But why is Hebrews in the New Testament? Which Paul did not write, by the way, which is why I have that question there. But canonicity in the New Testament, important topic. That's week number 4. Week 5, the relationship between the Old and the New Testaments. Week 6, the New Testament use of the Old Testament. And that to me has kind of captivated my mind for like the last 2 years. So I'm really looking forward to that one. And then week 7, we'll look at the ministry of Jesus. And then week 8, we'll look at the final week of Jesus. And then week 9, Reformed Roundtables group presentations. All right. Any questions or complaints about the course schedule? All right.
No, we're
Okay.
good.
None?
Yeah, none.
Okay. All right. Well, go ahead and grab your notes for week 1, the intertestamental period. Okay, so the intertestamental period, the time between the Old and New Testaments, is crucial for understanding the New Testament. I think if most of us were unfamiliar with the Old Testament in general, the kind of just the historicity of it and the flow of Old Testament history, I suspect that all of us are like completely in the dark about the intertestamental period. This period stretches from Malachi, whose book marks the end of the Old Testament era, about 430 BC, to John the Baptist, who's actually the last of the Old Testament prophets, which I'm sure you all know that. If you don't know that, if you think about it, you're like, yeah, that's true. He was the last of the Old Testament prophets. And of course, that was about 30 AD. This period, the intertestamental period, provides the historical soil out of which the New Testament world and its writings spring. So the cultural, political, religious, historic landscape of the New Testament era grows up out of the intertestamental period. It is the product of its times, and the culmination of over 4 centuries of historical developments. So this period can be divided up into 4 eras: Persian rule, Greek rule, Hasmonean rule, and Roman rule. Right? Persian, Greek, Hasmonean, Roman. Obviously, Persian rule begins before we leave the Old Testament. The Roman rule begins, is going on when we are introduced to the New Testament. There are 2 eras in there that are not in either the Old or the New Testament, the Greek rule and the Hasmonean rule, although the Hasmonean rule is in the Apocrypha. It's in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. We read about historical events related to the Hasmonean rule in 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the Apocrypha. A word needs to be said about the enduring legacy of 586 BC. And before we even look at it, what happened in 586? Anybody?
Babylonian conquest and the temple was destroyed.
Yep. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586, right? Which prophet is that event associated with? Whose ministry is associated with that event?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, that's right. Hopefully that's still pretty fresh on your mind from the Old Testament survey course. The benchmark historical event that sets the stage for the intertestamental period is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586. As noted in our Old Testament survey session, this is one of the most significant events in Jewish history and had several massive consequences. Its impact can be seen in several ways. It marked the virtual end of Israel as a nation state. There's a brief 80-year period during the Hasmonean rule, which we'll talk about. But besides that, Israel did not exist as a nation state from 586 BC all the way until 1948. Number 2, it ended the corporate temple-centric system of worship as the primary feature of Judaism. So before the destruction of Jerusalem, that was all there was corporate worship at the temple. That was the hub of the Jewish religion. Now, there was an aspect of that was reincorporated during the Second Temple period, but the synagogue had already kind of risen up to take its place as kind of ground zero of religious life for a Jew of that period. And for all intents and purposes, that kind of corporate temple-centric system was demolished with the destruction of the first temple in 586. But that gave rise, like it says there, to the synagogue, which is the conceptual precursor to the New Testament local church. It's basically a Jewish local church, and to a more personal, ethics-based form of the Jewish religion. So in the absence of the ability of a lot of Jews to offer sacrifices and be in Jerusalem at the feasts, they just kind of swapped that out for a local synagogue. And then religion for the Jew of that period became something similar to what Christianity is for us, a personal, devotional, ethics-based type of religion. Number 3, it marked the beginning of the end of pagan idolatry in Israel in favor of a fierce monotheism. which can be seen in the mid and late intertestamental period and up through the time of Christ. You remember they wanted to stone Jesus for calling himself God. If you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you will find out just how fiercely monotheistic the Jews of this period were. So all those idolatry problems were essentially, that problem was essentially solved with the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Now, it took some time for that to wear off and for them to become really embedded in monotheism. But that was, in fact, one of the consequences of the destruction of Jerusalem. And then number 4, it created the conditions for the rise of Aramaic and the Samaritans, a language and a people, respectively, of mixed Jewish and Chaldean origins. And if you remember, Chaldean, Babylonian, Babylonian, Chaldean, same thing, right? And there's a really interesting footnote there. I would encourage you to read it when you have a chance. And if you can, actually look up the sources that are cited there. But the summary of that footnote is that Jesus probably spoke Aramaic, but there's at least a good argument that he actually spoke Greek as his native language. But either way, he would have been as equally comfortable and bilingual in both of those languages, in Aramaic and Greek. You know, I think about something like Suresh. If any of you guys know Suresh, you know, his native language is Telugu, but he is just as equally comfortable in Hindi because that's the national language and the language that all Indians communicate together in. And something like that is what Jesus' fluidness in Greek and Aramaic would have been. He probably spoke Aramaic, but there's a really good case that he spoke Greek. And Hebrew was more of a formal language used for special ceremonial purposes. It would have been something that they would have used in the synagogue, or it's, you know, like the Passover, things like that. But it wouldn't have been spoken in everyday life the way that Aramaic and Greek were. But of course, the very language that Jesus spoke in his home and the language that the New Testament was written in is, you know, a direct result of all of historical factors going back almost 600 years. All right. Any questions about any of that? Okay. Page 2, section 1, Persian rule. This begins in the Old Testament. Before you leave the Old Testament, the Jews are under Persian rule. You know, you think Esther, you think Nehemiah, think Ezra. They're under Persian rule before you get out of the Old Testament. Okay, this period begins with the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians under Cyrus, which you read about in the Old Testament, and his generous policy of allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild religious sites such as Jerusalem's temple. See Cyrus' decree in Ezra, and you can also see a prophecy about that around 700 BC in Isaiah. Important names during the early and middle part of this Persian period are Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and important events were the rebuilding of the Jewish temple and the walls of Jerusalem. After about 425 BC, which is right around the time of Malachi, the Persians began about 100 years of decline until they fell to Alexander the Great in 331 BC. Okay, so when you think about the Persian period, think about Cyrus and the post-Babylonian Persian Empire. So the Persians defeat the Babylonians. Okay, when you think about the Persian period, think about Cyrus and the Persians who defeated the Babylonians. Okay. The second major era of the intertestamental period is the Greek or the Seleucid rule. The Seleucids are actually a dynasty that descended from Alexander the Great, but they're Greeks. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't. But you can think about it that way. Seleucid Greek, Greek Seleucid. You can think about it that way, and you should think about it that way. During this period, Greek culture becomes the dominant cultural influence in the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, and Greek is established as the lingua franca of the known world. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire devolves into two important Greek dynasties, namely the Ptolemies, who controlled the south, namely Egypt, and the Seleucids, who controlled Mesopotamia, Palestine, and modern-day Turkey and Greece. And when I use that term Palestine, I'm just talking about that whole general area of Israel, Lebanon, modern-day Jordan, just that whole kind of region. Christians have historically used the term that way. Scholars have. You read commentaries all the time, and they're going to use that word like that. So that's what we're talking about, okay? We're talking about the general region that includes Israel and that's around Israel. And the Seleucids also controlled modern-day Turkey and Greece. So if you think back to our Old Testament survey, you know, you think of the Fertile Crescent, which starts where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers meet. So the Seleucids controlled all of that. They controlled Israel, and then they controlled into Turkey, while the Ptolemies controlled the south in Egypt. The Seleucid dynasty was the regional power over Palestine at this time, and Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a brutal Seleucid dictator whose persecutions led to the Maccabean revolt. And that's in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And there are some really brutal accounts of Antiochus's the terror that he reaped on those people. There's one account in the Maccabees of Antiochus forbidding the practice of circumcision, and some of the women, some of the Jewish women still had their baby circumcised. Well, as a punishment for that violation of Antiochus' decree, his prohibition against circumcision, he actually killed the babies and tied them around their mothers' necks and forced them to parade through the streets with their own children around their neck. Antiochus Epiphanes was a brutal tyrant. And he's really kind of the lowlight, I would say, of this Seleucid period. So when you think of the Greek period, think of the Seleucids, think of Antiochus Epiphanes, and think of his rival, Judas Maccabeus. We've all heard that name, Judas Maccabeus. The Maccabees are the family that he comes from. So when you think about this period, it's after the Persians. It's after the death of Alexander the Great. You think about the Greek period, you think about the Seleucids, Antiochus Epiphanes, and Judas Maccabee. Okay. Section number 3, Hasmonean rule. The Maccabees were a ferociously committed Jewish family and the leaders of the successful revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greek Seleucids, beginning with the priests Mattathias and his sons, most famously Judas Maccabeus. Okay, so Judas Maccabee is a member of this Maccabee family, and they're a family within the Hasmonean dynasty. Hasmoneans is the proper name for this dynastic family that was able to establish rule in an independent Jewish kingdom in Judea after their victory over the Seleucids. This period of less than 80 years marks the only time between 586 BC and 1948 AD that an independent Jewish state existed. So any questions about that period? Hasmoneans, Maccabees. Think about those as the same thing.
Yeah, we
Okay?
got a question.
Yeah, okay, go for it.
Hey, Pastor Tony, Tim. So, simple question. Why
Yeah.
is that Homonian dynasty and that rule not normally considered when we look at other, like if you go to a history class in high school or in college, they're going to tell you about Babylon, they're going to tell you about Greek, they're going to tell you about the Romans, they're going to skip the Homonians. Why do you think that is?
Well, the Hasmoneans were not a world power. They were a really small, relatively, compared to all the other dynasties and kingdoms. The Hasmoneans were a blip on the radar, you know. So I think they don't have any meaningful significance to world history outside of their role, outside of Jewish history. That's where their importance is at. So I think that's the reason why. But when you think of the Hasmoneans, think of the Maccabees, right? Okay, Roman rule, 63 BC. This 80-year period of the Hasmoneans takes us to the beginning of Roman rule, and that is where we start to see the beginnings of the New Testament era take shape, okay? This period began when the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC, which ended Jewish independence under the Hasmoneans and marked the beginning of Judea as a Roman puppet kingdom. We all know that, there's Jewish King Herod, and yet, he's subject to a governor, like a simple governor, and that's Pilate, of course. So Judea as a puppet kingdom of Rome begins right there in 63 BC. In 40 BC, the Herodian dynasty emerged when Herod the Great was appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate, and he ruled as a client king with Roman backing. So the Herodians, they were pro-Rome guys, and they had Roman support, and that began in 40 BC. And obviously, we still see the Herods on the throne in the New Testament. Okay, so Herod's reign, Herod the Great, his reign was marked by extensive building projects, including massive renovations to the Second Temple, as well as political strife and heavy taxation, which caused resentment among the Jews. And now now it makes sense. Okay, this is why the Zealots hated them. They hated the Herodians. Herod died in 4 BC, which you read about in Matthew 2, shortly after the birth of Jesus. And the Herodian dynasty was ended by the Romans because of mismanagement about 6 AD. But Rome would continue to rule Judea directly until about 135 AD. But obviously, it's Roman rule that's the political backdrop behind the New Testament. Okay, so when you think of the Roman period, you can think of the Roman rule, just like we see it in the New Testament. It begins with the Herodian puppet dynasty and the birth of Jesus. Or you think of the beginning of the Herodian puppet dynasty and the birth of Jesus. You think of all these things when you think of of Roman rule, the Roman period. All right, so we got these 4 different periods in intertestamental period in this intertestamental era. The first period ends before we leave the New Testament. That's the Persian period. It's followed by the Greek Seleucids. That is followed by the Jewish Hasmoneans. And then that is followed by the Romans. Hopefully that's straightforward enough and easy enough to remember. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts about any of that? All right.
No.
Okay. So I'm going to get you guys out of here way earlier than I anticipated. So this one's free, okay? Last section here. Section 5, the impact of intertestamental history on the New Testament. Here are several important developments during the intertestamental period that had both direct and indirect impact on the New Testament and the world of the New Testament. Number 1 is the development of the synagogue, which we already talked about. That was sometime during the 2nd century BC. A kind of Jewish local church came to prominence during that time. The rise of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, also around that same time. These two different groups. The Pharisees would have been, quote unquote, the theological conservatives, and the Sadducees would have been like theological liberals. They only accepted the law of Moses. They rejected the resurrection. They rejected spirit beings and angels, anything supernatural. They're really just ancient theological liberals. Nobody knows exactly how the synagogue or the Pharisees or the Sadducees came into existence. Nobody really knows that, but it was around that period that we see them start to develop. The Essenes also arose during this period. They were separatists and strict ascetics with a zealous eschatological outlook. And they also had really rigorous religious rituals that included something similar to baptism. Many scholars believe that John the Baptist was an Essene, or that he was a member of a group that was related to them or similar to them. And even just with that short description, you can see why people would think that. You know, he obviously had similarities to those groups. The establishment of Greek as the lingua franca of the known world. Greek became the language that was spoken across the entire Mediterranean world and the ancient Near East. Everybody had their own languages. Rome, obviously, the Romans spoke Roman. The Jews in Judea probably spoke Aramaic, but Greek was the language that everybody communicated in. The development of the Septuagint also came out of this period. What is the Septuagint?
It's a Greek translation of the Old Testament by 70 priests.
That's right. That's right. It was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament by 70 Hebrew scholars. That's why we call it the Septuagint. That's the Latin word for 70. And LXX is obviously Roman numerals for 70. And it is the Septuagint that is the Bible of our New Testament characters. It was Jesus' Bible. It was Paul's Bible. It seems that New Testament writers quote, we'll get into this more later when we, I don't remember which week it is off the top of my head. In one of our classes later, when we're talking about the New Testament use of the Old Testament, we'll talk a little bit more about this. But New Testament authors quote the Septuagint over the Hebrew about 50% of the time. So about half the quotes come from the Septuagint, about half come from the Hebrew. There are a whole bunch of quotes that clearly the writer is working kind of from memory. There are places where New Testament authors quote of an Old Testament text appears to be a kind of mashup of both the Hebrew and the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is unique because it really reflects that thematic kind of thinking and that typological hermeneutic that was so common among Hebrews at the time and that our New Testament authors employed. And what's really interesting is that in about 9 out of every 10 places where the Septuagint and the Hebrew differ, New Testament authors go with the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew. And that's really interesting. And what do you take away from that? Well, the thing I like to say is, I don't know exactly what we learned from it, but I do know it does mean this. It means don't hate the NIV. It at least means that, but nevertheless, the Septuagint is tremendously important development in Jewish history and for our New Testament. As a matter of fact, one commentator that I read several years back, he said that if you really want to know how the mind of the first century Jew worked, read the Septuagint. That's the best reflection of the way that Hebrews thought at that time, which is quite a remarkable statement. So the development of the Septuagint cannot be underestimated. And then lastly, another impact of the intertestamental period on the New Testament is the establishment of the Pax Romana, literally the Roman peace. It was roughly a 200-year period of relative peace, stability, and economic prosperity throughout the Roman Empire, spanned roughly 30 BC, about 30 years before Jesus was born, to all the way to 100 AD. This era was marked by large-scale peace and effective governments within the empire, which facilitated safe travel, trade, and communication across vast territories, and it directly led to the rapid advancement of Christianity across the entire Mediterranean world. So the Pax Romana is pretty important for the fact of the New Testament, the fact that we have the New Testament. Obviously, Paul's labor across the entire Mediterranean world during that first century, that he could largely travel in peace on good roads, and there's the finances across believers and in different churches, and Paul himself, that enabled his travel. So the Pax Romana is, you simply do not have the New Testament or New Testament Christianity without the Pax Romana. And that's it. We are 11 minutes early. I thought we would go longer than this, so looks like we're done ahead of time. Any thoughts or questions before we wrap it up?
Yeah, along with the Pax Romana, you had the Roman roads, which allowed the legions to move anywhere across there, like within 5 days.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also transportation and commerce go hand in hand there.
Yep. Yes. Does anybody, does that kind of put that intertestamental period into perspective for anybody? Does it give you an idea of what actually happened during that period that led up to the New Testament? I'm trying to be as like simple and basic and memorable as possible so that we just understand the big picture of what happened during that time. Tim, I can see you have the microphone.
Yeah, I got a few questions, so we'll see how fast we go. So the first question is, I hear people talking about the lead up to the New Testament, and generally they'll cite something of a historical note that there was a growing anticipation for Messiah, right? That as you get closer to the beginning of the New Testament, there was this general sentiment that Messiah should be somewhere, he should be coming, it should be today, it should be next week, it should be this year. Do you find that to be true from your reading? Because if my memory is right, and I'm not sure if it is, that didn't the Maccabees say they were Messiah, or didn't people ascribe that they were messianic figures?
There were people who believed that Judas Maccabee was the Messiah. There are obviously some, apocalyptic groups like the Essenes. But as far as how anticipated the Messiah was, I really don't know. That's a good question. I really don't know, to be honest. And just as I'm thinking about it, I think, well, you read Ezekiel and you read, and Ezekiel's writing after 586, like his ministry began before, but the end of his ministry, the last 15 chapters or so of Ezekiel are post 586, and those are really incredible chapters. so you read those, you read Zechariah, and it's, you read Zephaniah. It's very difficult, I think, to read those passages, I can only imagine, and not feel like these things are coming. I think when we read Revelation, we read some of these kind of veiled, ambiguous kind of passages in the New Testament about the return of Jesus, and it's difficult not to feel the imminence of it. J.C. Ryle, there's a little book behind me right here that I've been reading, a little book by J.C. Ryle, and he talks about how bad of judges we are of our times. He mentions it several times that we tend to overestimate the importance of things during our day because of the simple fact that we're impacted by it. This is kind of a long rambling answer, but I guess my point is that I suspect they were probably a lot like us. You have some people who are like, oh yeah, everybody thinks Messiah is coming, and then you got other people who think that everybody is the Messiah, or that all these things are pointing to the Messiah. I suspect that if we could go through and read all the relevant data, we would probably come to that conclusion, is my guess.
Okay. And then I got another question.
Okay.
When was the Mishnah written? Was that during the intertestamental period?
Oh man. Yeah, I'm not really I am no expert on all the different various traditions and writings within Jewish history. So that's a question I can't answer. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, because what I understand is basically just a collection of commentaries on the Old Testament, but I wonder how much it was used as, because that's what we see with the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus speaks as one having authority, not as the scribes, right? Which
No.
is their method of speaking is, this rabbi said that, and that rabbi said this, right?
Right.
Which is very much kind of what you get in the Mishnah. So just trying to think about if that's there at that time, and that's shaping the way they think, that it's no longer just, well, I read this in the Old Testament, as we call it, and so that's what it is. But now it's, well, you have to cite a credentialed person who can tell you what that means,
Yeah.
right? If that's kind of like the way things are, or maybe that's just the way that the leadership makes it, because that's how it is in the New Testament when we get there.
Yeah, I wish that I could answer that question, but I can't. I know there are several different Jewish traditions that really become dominant among Jews during the intertestamental period. And there are like commentaries on the Old Testament, and then commentaries on commentaries. And I just don't know enough about those to be able to say anything meaningful about it.
Okay. Well, Steve just told me it was a 3rd century AD.
Okay, there you go. All right.
There you go. Phone a friend. My last question is do you see any significance in the change from Rome as a republic to Rome as an empire affecting the context of the setup for the New Testament?
I mean, that's another one that's beyond my pay grade. I do know that Rome kind of struggled back and forth between republic, parties that were committed to the republic, and those that were committed to the empire, and that was kind of an ongoing battle for a long time. But I really don't know. That's another one that I don't know. So you got me.
Hey,
Yeah,
Tony,
so-
it's Dave Edmiston.
Brother Dave, how are you doing?
brother? Good, man.
I'm good, man.
Hey, I'm definitely not as church history scholarly as some of the others here. So just big picture, what are we to make of the testamentary period, the intertestamental period, and the period since the New Testament was canonized? So in the sense, I guess what I'm asking is, you've got from Adam through the end to Malachi, you've got a pretty complete message from God in history of at least Israel, right? And then we just have this 400-year gap Then we have everything related to Jesus through the apostolic period. And then we have a several 100-year, multiple 1,000-year gap. And just, conceptually, maybe you could re-educate me on the importance of that and those gaps. And I guess kind of the big question is why would God record his word and then have these periods where it disappears? Is it because Israel disappeared? Is it because of Messiah?
Well, it doesn't. I think what church history teaches you, and I mean, I'm not an expert on church history, but I do know enough to know that there were faithful men all the way down through the centuries. The Lord's real people. There were even during the Middle Ages, even in the Eastern Orthodox Church, even in the East in the 6 and 7 and 800s, there are faithful believers in all these different places, all the way down through the centuries, up all the way up until the Reformation. I think the question that you're asking is one that that all of us, if you listen to enough lectures or you do enough reading, you kind of hear people say that as a little bit of a dig, against us as Christians today. Like, church history ends with the New Testament, and then there's nothing, and then it picks up again with the Reformation, and that's kind of all we know. So it's like Jesus and the apostles, then Luther, and then it goes to the Puritans, and then there's us, and that's kind of all we know about. But the Lord definitely had faithful people all the way down through church history, between the apostles all the way to the Reformation. There are, and there are all kinds of them, tons of them. And I guess, well, to answer your question, what you see is, a lot of bad and like bad ideas and wrong ideas about different things. It kind of takes the church a little bit of time to get straight on the Trinity and on the person and work of Jesus. It takes a good 1,500 years for them to get clear on baptism. You even have Augustine in the 400s saying things that are kind of amenable to the idea of baptismal regeneration. But at the same time, you also have them affirming like very clear truth about salvation by faith alone, and the sovereignty of God, and the exclusivity of Jesus to save, and the necessity of the changed life as a fruit of regeneration. You just see that all the way down through church history.
Thanks.
All right. Any others? We're all the way to 8 now. Okay. David Mozienko, you mind closing us in prayer?
Father, we thank you for this time that we have to gather to study you and your word. And we thank you for all of the men that you've gathered who truly seek you, your truth, and for the elders that you've placed to oversee us. And we pray for your continued blessing on this ministry. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, brothers. Thank you, guys.